I met your colleague. Okay, that's the recording. Yeah. I met your colleague, Nick, at EGU this year, and we were there organizing a town hall meeting for Blue Carbon with a focus on early career researchers. And we had a really nice discussion in Vienna. And that was partly supported by the Sea Blues, the Horizon Europe project that Nick and I are part of. And it was a sort of realization that in this emerging field of blue carbon and in the context of the academy, as it were, at EGU, that, career opportunities and navigating into blue carbon was a relatively new opportunity that we could try to support. So I'm delighted to be kicking off this series. I'm going to use slides from a variety of sources, and as part of the Sea Blues collaboration, there's a partner project in the People's Republic of China. So you might just see at the bottom there that I've actually used these slides earlier this week, in fact, for a joint presentation with colleagues in China. And some of what I'll say is really about delivering the science and the evidence to create new policies in this blue carbon space. So, of course, with Horizon Europe across the European area, there's a great deal of interest in working as a bloc to improve policy in this space that could incorporate blue carbon thinking and blue carbon opportunities. And I'm really happy to discuss that work with you, partly because I'm employed a few days a year to support Scottish government and policy development in this space. And we've been going through some of these exercises recently. And then I think more importantly at the global scale now is to use blue carbon science to build credibility in conservation and restoration objectives. So we're aware that there's a growing interest in public-private finance, of course, in carbon crediting, a growing nature market as well. And we want to make sure that these are robust and secure and that we can build investor confidence to drive these forward. Because ultimately, these are going to be the ways in which we can restore nature and make a difference. So it's not quite the cold calculating scientist presentation that you might have expected. I am saying something here about nature positive futures. And I think often in science, we can be motivated by this kind of agenda. Certainly, if you've worked in these environments, I'm sure most of us would agree they're wonderful places and they deserve our protection and conservation. In terms of the work that we do and the way that we create impact, I just wanted to throw up some recent and upcoming meetings. So I mentioned EGU a moment ago, but we're just on the cusp, a few days away from the One Ocean Science Congress in Nice in France that will be the precursor to the UN Ocean Conference the following week. So these are really important places and spaces. And I think on social media as well, if you're trying to create visibility for yourself or your work, I think there will be a great deal of interest at the moment in the oceans and how the oceans are supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that UN program that I mentioned, GoBC, is part of a UN Ocean Decade program to support these objectives. There are various other meetings where governments assemble. An example of this will be the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. They have a general assembly that takes place once a year. The next one is coming up in late June, early July. And, this is where we can, I think, shape as well the international agenda for ocean research. And then I think perhaps more relevant to this audience is the AGU Oslo Ocean Science Conference. And I particularly wanted to flag this because I think there will be some great early career researcher opportunities at this conference, which is leaving US for the first time and actually coming to Glasgow in Scotland. And that's in February 2026. Um, and I know because I've been supporting a session proposal that there almost certainly will be opportunities to present blue carbon science at this major international conference in Glasgow in February. So, quite a nice lead-in time there to start to think about that. I'm hopeful that the session we've proposed will be successful and more than happy once that's confirmed, to be in contact with anyone who's interested in presenting or perhaps supporting that session. I mentioned this One Ocean Science Congress, and I was sort of reflecting a little on my own career, and I'm going to do that in a moment, just to give you some ideas of developing a career and not so much advice, but at least reflecting on my own journey. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is that often when we have these panel discussions, there is a tendency and has been a tendency to invite senior colleagues, recognized colleagues in the field. This is a panel, a town hall that I'm organizing next week at the One Ocean Science Congress in France. And, I think one of the things that I'm conscious of in my own career is the importance of networking, trying to get to these conferences, but also increasingly with the diversity agenda, to make opportunities as an early career researcher to contribute, for example, to panel discussions. So we have in this session, maybe not as successfully as I would have liked, but we do, have reasonably good gender balance and career stage balance reflected in the panel that we're organizing. So again, I think, don't be put off by the idea that you're still early career researcher and that you can't contribute to these efforts. And in fact, it's in my experience, it's about building these networks and emphasizing your willingness to contribute. So I think those of you who've started this BluECR network, you're doing exactly the right things. And I think you can use BluECR to promote your own colleagues into some of these networks. And as I say, with this meeting coming up in February in 2026 in Glasgow, be really happy to work with you in the network to make sure that you're well represented and promoted at the AGU Oslo Ocean Science Meeting. Okay, so just a little bit about myself now. I'm based at the University of St Andrews. I joined the university in 1999, so I've been here some time. Before then, I was a lecturer at Durham University and then postdoced for 5 years. My background is in geosciences. My PhD is in ocean sciences. And I've worked with the Geological Survey of the UK, and I've held postdocs with the Royal Society of London, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and with NERC, the UKRI. So it's been an early career, I would say, of change and of mobility. And I've worked in the UK. I've had some study time in the US and postdoc time and early career researcher time in Denmark and in Norway. So I think, reflecting there a little on the ability of mobility being quite an important theme at times in progressing at my early career myself. I'm also a visiting researcher at the Scottish Association for Marine Sciences, so I'm a visiting professor with them. And the backstory to that is that about 10 years ago, I felt I needed a little bit of a change from St Andrews, having joined in 1999, and the opportunity for a part-time role at SAMS came up. And that, really enriched my career at a later stage. And I found that, a very positive thing. And I've kept the association with them. It's a wonderful place, wonderful colleagues, and a great facility for marine research as well. And then over the years, as your career progresses, I suppose it's been an opportunity to take on leadership roles. So I currently chair the Scottish Government's Blue Carbon Forum and do some advice work for Scottish Government who are very interested in this space and have in many ways led this space here in the UK over a number of years. I chair this UN Ocean Decade program for blue carbon, so that's called GoBC. And then I'm leading as part of work packages within these Horizon Europe projects called Sea Blues and POMP. So in time, I guess, these opportunities arise to take on leadership roles, but they don't happen immediately. And I think reflecting on the career pathway, it has been about being collaborative. So I think one of the hallmarks of my work has always been highly collaborative. I like ideas. I find the hard work of the research and papers, more challenging as we all do. And I think over time, I've led more and more of proposal development and have been, in a way, doing more and more of my research by proxy. So, for example, Alex Houston, who's on the call, is a recent PhD student. He's going to stay on for a postdoctoral position in Sea Blues, this Horizon Europe project. And, part of the academic journey, the career, has been to support and develop early career researchers. And of course, there are benefits to doing that and opportunities to engage in science that you can't always do yourself. So I think these networks, this theme of networks and collaboration is extremely important. So that was me as I was an undergraduate, I guess contemplating my career ahead of me. And the reality is, I had very little idea. I'd never really had any mentoring, and things were a series of accidents in many ways. Um, but I think there were certain interests and passions. So having said the strategic stuff, I suppose, reflecting a little on that journey, it's always ultimately, my advice is do what it interests you, excites you, and creates that passion for what you're doing, because that will fuel you through a lot of difficult times. And I was lucky in some ways that I was able to do that. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly talk you through a sort of career potted history. I mentioned that I'd worked overseas and had a research fellowship. I was very lucky in a European mobility scheme to spend a year and a half in Bergen in Norway. And at that time, I was working on foraminifera. Spent about 30 years of my career looking down a microscope, studying tiny little microfossils in marine sediments, and had a passion for these wonderful microfossils that I was looking at and under the microscope. In some ways, of course, the application of this work, micropaleontology, we might call it, more recently, I think the theme of paleoceanography, but essentially reconstructing past environments using these proxies that are very abundant in marine sediments was the skill set that I built up. And in that approach, it led to all sorts of interesting collaborations. For example, micropaleontology is largely built on a 250-year legacy of morphological systematics, so the shape and form under the microscope. But with a PhD student, Angela Roberts, about 10 years ago now, we were working on a fusion of molecular and morphological systematics. And, that was fascinating. Not my area of expertise. I was supporting the morphological systematics. But I think being willing and prepared to find these new tangents and collaborations has made the career interesting and exciting. I think this might be the best paper that I've been involved in. But I have to admit, it's probably only been cited half a dozen times. But I think this will still be an important paper in 100 years' time. So, I think clinging on to these ideas of what we do maybe has some lasting value has been something important. The other thing is that work that we did with Angela then led to a larger collaboration with scientists across the Northeast Atlantic. And so, when you publish a paper, other people are reading it and making that connection. And I think really to be open to the opportunities that, yes, you're going to share your ideas. In a way, you're partly giving those ideas away, but that's going to let you build a new collaboration and lead to something else. And I think, for me, that's been an important lesson, is just find those meaningful, good collaborations, find people that you like to work with, and don't be frightened to let things, run in a new direction. The other thing that we've been doing and that I was able to do here at St Andrews, because we have a Scottish Oceans Institute, is with that knowledge of foraminifera, we were able to develop experiments and experimental work. And in fact, I worked with my wife, who was a PhD student, was still married, by the way, and she worked with a colleague here in our School of Biology. And that's been quite a fruitful collaboration with Professor Patterson here in our School of Biology, and we continue to work across the disciplines. So in fact, I'm in a School of Geography and Sustainable Development, but we all sit together in this virtual Scottish Oceans Institute. And at this time, we were interested in how the morphology of foraminifera might have a role to play in their feeding. And this led us then to some work with another PhD student when ocean acidification was really rising on the research agenda, to think about how functional morphology of foraminifera would be compromised by changing ocean pH. And although I hadn't really realized it at the time, all of this was sort of leading in a direction of the ocean's uptake of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. The oceans were changing. There were these thematic programs that were encouraging the science community to work on these problems. And I think the other thing then is that if I look back at the career, it's had some themes, of course, and expertise in certain areas, but it's also been quite opportunistic. So, new funding opportunities come along. We need funding to drive our research. And I think I've been quite open to seeking those new funding opportunities, and that leads to new collaborations and new research directions. And then, we've developed this to think more broadly about the impacts on ecosystems. So again, a changing ocean and the functioning of ecosystems, has certainly been a theme in the foraminiferal research. Um, that's led to other collaborations, so our expertise here to grow and do experiments on foraminifera seawater cultures. I should say they're protists, so there's nothing too horrible in terms of the experiments. But that led us to new collaborations with shell-based geochemistry and trying to do experiments to understand how those proxies are being encoded in the shells of foraminifera. Other work, and of course, when you work on foraminifera in sediments, you're working on stratigraphy. So that's a fundamental, I suppose, skill that I've brought from my background in geosciences, that sediments are accumulating, they build up these stratigraphies. And again, with another PhD student, Alex Cage, but 20 years of work on tephra on my part before that, we started to look at younger and younger sediment stratigraphies. We were by then working in the fjords, or the sea lochs as we call them, on the west coast of Scotland, and reconstructing stratigraphies using these tephra horizons. And that's been part of a theme of building, I suppose, event stratigraphies and chronologies. In this case, working with Rasmussen, who worked on the Greenland ice cores, linking North Atlantic records to the very detailed climate records of the Greenland ice cores. But again, tying those together with tephra, these volcanic ash layers. And thinking then about how we trace time in the ocean and build chronologies. And of course, when we're thinking about stratigraphy, even be it a salt marsh stratigraphy that's accumulated over hundreds or thousands of years, we need these robust chronological tools. So I think my background, again, whilst I didn't realize it, has been useful in applying to these blue carbon ecosystems because, there's a strong foundation in these principles and approaches to building chronology, good and reliable chronologies. And I'll skip over this, but at that time and at these time scales, we're also thinking about climate variability and how to link these using geological tracers. So the idea that sediments, rocks could be transported from one environment and deposited in another, is very much a theme in the geosciences, and of course is very relevant to our understanding of blue carbon ecosystems as well. This led on to work on radiocarbon. So I've spent a lot of time. This actually is a paper from 1995, so I'm starting to date myself here a little as well. And it's been a very well cited paper. My supervisor at the time, who was Dick Kroon, told me not to write this paper, but I wrote it anyway, put his name on it, and it's been very well cited. And that led us to collaborations with numerical modelers, thinking about how the ocean overturning could be explained and tested by these radiocarbon data. So that was really interesting work. And we developed this a little bit further about a few years later, and trying to explain how climate change is driving the ocean's carbon cycle, and that this is reflected in the radiocarbon concentration of seawater that's then encoded into the shells of mollusks and foraminifera and so on. And that led to these really big collaborations and the international calibration of the radiocarbon timescale. And in a way, this was a 30-year journey to this collaboration. But if you know about INCAL, you know these are very fundamental to the calibration of the radiocarbon timescales. So they would be used in all sorts of areas of science, including archaeology. And, you know, huge citations. So I never expected this when we were starting the work that we were doing. But I think that's that thing about collaborating and building those networks and collaborations. They sometimes lead you to unexpected places. And this has certainly been very rewarding in terms of the citations that it has attracted. Okay, and at the same time, then we were, as I said, working on these sea loch or fjord records in Scotland. We knew that these were natural sediment traps capturing large amounts of sediment. And at this time, I was working in a EU project called Millennium. And the debate at the time was how unusual it was called the hockey stick debate of Michael Mann's, was, you know, how unusual is this late 20th century warming if we look back over the last 1,000 years. So a whole group of researchers across Europe reconstructing climate records from different archives. And we started to work on these sea loch fjord records to reconstruct the climate. This led to a North Atlantic reconstruction. And in many ways, I suppose, you know, the fun on this journey has been the field work, meeting new people. This is Birgit from University of Bergen. We're in a fjord near Bergen on the west coast of Norway there. And, you know, it's the opportunities, I think, to do field work that have been really interesting, and at times building these new networks and collaborations. So again, whilst that can be hard, and it gets harder, I suppose, at different stages of your career and your personal life, I've really enjoyed the opportunities to travel and be at sea. And probably spent in total nearly 2 years at sea over my whole career. So I've been on some wonderful cruises over that time period. Okay, now I'm going to try and move forward now from this theme of fjords to the realization with Craig Smeaton, who was another PhD student, then postdoc, and now member of faculty with us here at St Andrews. The realization that these rapidly accumulating fjord sediments were also capturing large quantities of organic carbon. And this was work really nice work, actually, that Craig developed as part of his PhD, where we're starting to think about the inputs to these long-term stores. So not strictly blue carbon. Those of you who know the IPCC guidance will say, well, that's not a blue carbon ecosystem. But, you know, this idea of blue carbon being an emerging field, and that these coastal sediments might be an important component of carbon storage in the marine environment, is what we've been working on. And that's led us, of course, to a realization in conversations with policy colleagues about the impacts on these ecosystems. Now, in this case, we're looking at a measure of bottom trawling contact. So this is a direct pressure on the seabed that's disturbing those stores of carbon and potentially, it's argued, releasing large amounts of that carbon back to the atmosphere as it's remineralized to carbon dioxide. So, an efflux from the surface ocean back to the atmosphere. And this topic area has really been gaining momentum. So what I would say to you is if you're working in the field of blue carbon or interested in blue carbon, these emerging areas of blue carbon, particularly in our shelf seas, my feeling is that these are going to be more important. We're going to see more research opportunities and funding in this area of science in the next few years. So it's certainly an area I would say that's hotting up. Anyway, the map shows us, of course, that some areas of the seabed are under a great deal more pressure than others. And what we were working on as part of the mapping of the UK EZ was a comparison between the stores of carbon. So this is on the left, the organic carbon density in those surface sediments, and comparing that to the pressure maps. So the ratio here is something called the swept area ratio. So essentially tells you how often that area of seabed, and it's gridded, how often that's impacted by bottom trawling. And if you put those two things together, we began to realize here that some parts of our shelf seas are very vulnerable to these pressures. And, I think this is an important aspect of managing our shelf seas. We know already that bottom trawling has significant impact on benthic ecosystems. What we're beginning to realize is that those impacts, those pressures, are also potentially releasing stores of the most vulnerable carbon back into the seawater through resuspension and potentially through remineralization, causing losses to those long-term stores. And we've done a lot of work. Coralie Hunt is another PhD student. We developed new types of mapping. Craig had produced those maps. That's the map of the UK EZ. And I think what's really nice in these papers, particularly the second one there, is that William Turrell is actually from Scottish Government. So by this stage, we were working in a sort of research partnership with Scottish Government, who were clearly interested in the evidence about these impacts because they're ultimately responsible for management actions. And they wanted, of course, the best possible evidence because there are some difficult decisions when you start managing the seabed, perhaps restricting certain activities in terms of those stakeholder interests. So I'm thinking here, for example, of a strong fishing lobby who would want to continue these activities because they would argue important for the economy of Scotland. And then with Craig, we started to think more about the quality of the carbon itself. So how vulnerable might it be? How reactive might it be versus simply, and what had gone before, and to some extent is still happening, is simply how much carbon is there. So we were developing our thinking as that progressed. And then with another PhD student, Kirsty Black, who now actually works in the offshore renewables sector, we started to think about putting the pressure, the mapping of the carbon, its reactivity, and sort of thinking about how vulnerable different bits of the seabed were. And Kirsty's work was actually recognized by Scottish ministers as being a really significant contribution to the evidence that I think is now driving further work to support what I think will be quite progressive management measures in the future. Okay, so the journey has been to provide evidence, working with a whole range of partners, in this case, inshore marine protected areas, doing these first assessments of blue carbon. This led us to work with government to introduce blue carbon into the climate change plan. This was in 2018. In 2021, when COP26 came to Glasgow in the UK, the Scottish government included blue carbon in a reference to its indicative NDC. Of course, the UK as a whole makes the NDC commitments. And then the politics of Scotland as a devolved nation in the UK, of course, play into some of this in terms of the wealth of blue carbon as part of any nation's natural capital. Okay, so where has this been taking us? Well, here in the UK, we've been working on an evidence partnership across the devolved nations. So there are opportunities when you do blue carbon research my advice is send your papers to government. There will be people in the science side of government directorates who will be interested in the work that you're doing. And these can become part of evidence. And I think this is an important agenda here in the UK at the moment in terms of demonstrating the impact from our research. And more, I think research has to demonstrate that it has this application or impact, as we call it here. So, of course, if your research can be contributing to these evidence needs statements, this is, I think, very important. With GoBC, we've been working to build the global community. As you can imagine, blue carbon science is more or less developed in different parts of the world. And as part of our commitment to the UN Ocean Decade, we were trying to grow that community and diversify it. That's quite hard to do. It's not a funded program. But I would be really interested, as I said at the start, to maybe work with BluECR and your network to promote the opportunities here. And we've met, for example, we're working, I think this paper's now in review, on recharting blue carbon science. It was led by Peter Macready, developing a sort of vision for the next decade of blue carbon science, thinking about where that science needs to go. And one of the areas that I think everybody recognized, and this is particularly true, I think when we step outside of Europe and we're thinking about different parts of the world and that ecological knowledge that might be, as it is in Europe, I think, deeply ingrained in academic knowledge forms, and therefore evidence to policy tends to follow a particular pathway. But in other parts of the world, and I think increasingly everywhere, the value of traditional ecological knowledge, being really important in terms of informing the best policies and management for coastal conservation. Because ultimately, whatever the science and the policy decision, these do need to be locally informed and locally accepted to be successful. I think sometimes in our science bubble, we can lose sight of that a little. So, that's one of the themes that this paper that we've been working on has developed. Here we see the question about improved estimates of human impacts and activities on blue carbon cycling. And I think one of the gaps in our knowledge, we've got pretty good understanding of habitat extent and stocks to some extent, but much less data and information on greenhouse gas emissions. For example, when we make conversions of land and land use change. And the photograph on the right here, as delicious as these shrimp were, and I ate them in Vietnam last year, these had been grown in aquaculture ponds where those ponds had been converted from mangrove forests. So, there's a cost in these conversions. And what we see in this figure is that aquapond conversion is driving very large methane fluxes and overall, has a large radiative forcing effect from those greenhouse gas emissions. So, we need, I think, improved understanding of how these activities and restoration, of course. So you might argue that converting aquaculture ponds back to mangrove forests, or at least changing the balance of those two habitats within the landscape, could have a really large impact on the overall blue carbon cycling. So those are themes. And I've just tried to pick out, as we did in this paper, a sort of global assessment. So in this case, for mangroves, starting to think about what the data is, episodic measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, not bad coverage, eddy covariance data still very limited. What do we know about carbon sequestration? Got more data on that. But lateral exchanges in and out of these ecosystems, dissolved in organic carbon, the total alkalinity fluxes, very limited data, and yet probably quite important in the overall balance of carbon uptake and long-term removal. So the message is, of course, there's plenty of science left to do in this field. This is an interesting plot. It comes from the Coastal Carbon Network. It's the 1 meter mangrove soil carbon stocks, in this case, across a range of geographies. And you can see here that different countries, have different average soil carbon stocks. Data densities are very uneven. That partly reflects open access contribution, I think, to the database. So one of the key messages that I think we must all share is, data sharing, open access of data sets and resources. And then the vertical red line with the shading here is essentially highlighting what we might currently be doing if we adopt a tier 1 based IPCC emission factor, that we would have a value that, yes, it might be rather appropriate for Cameroon, which is the data point here, but it's not fitting very well for Belize or, say, for New Zealand, where presumably there are limited mangrove distributions. So there's clearly a need and an effort required to improve the regional data that we have. And I'd just like to commend the work of the team at Smithsonian. I'm sure you can imagine that the climate funding, climate support for science is quite challenging in the US at the moment. But I think the team at the Smithsonian have been working really hard to build this coastal carbon library and atlas. And it's a really great place to put your data. There are safeguards. Data has to be cited if it's used, so it will generate citations for your own research. And it creates visibility for you as a researcher to actually add your data here. And sometimes invitations to join larger data compilations. So again, I think sometimes at the early career stage, there's a nervousness about sharing data, but actually these open access, well-managed resources are a great place to contribute to the global effort. We've also been developing at St Andrews, and we have a new summer program that's going to run this year. It's a 2-week summer program in blue carbon science that partners at WWF have been supporting us with scholarships. We plan to run this again in 2026. But GoBC has also been partnering in different countries around the world. So from the left there, we've got collaborations in India and exchanges in both directions with the collaboration there. Work in Vietnam. Our labs are hosting early career researchers, so hoping that we're supporting career development. And then on the right-hand side, this is from EGU in 2024. We've been inviting scientists to come and contribute to our sessions. And again, I think this is a really important theme for blue carbon at the moment, is to really push hard to build the credibility of the science into the mainstream academy. Because partly blue carbon has arisen from an environmental NGO advocacy for conservation, and the science, is in many ways important that we're strengthening the science to support that advocacy. And then finally, sitting on some mud in mangrove plantation in Vietnam. In the foreground there is Andrei Rovai, and we're subsampling a Russian or a D corer here to look at the soil carbon stocks. So the question arises, in those very muddy sediments, should we account for all of the carbon as additional, because this is a project, it's a former shrimp pond that's been turned over to mangrove plantation as part of the work of WWF with their local partners in Vietnam. And Alex Houston, who's on the call here as part of his PhD work, began to think about the sort of framework or the theory of this. And it's a little controversial, I guess, but additionality in blue carbon ecosystems, should we or could we have a more universally applicable accounting methodology? So the reality is that we have different accounting methodologies. And there's a sense, I think, particularly from investors and governments, maybe more so, that the science in this area is a little inconsistency, that we don't have a strong consensus. And I think this adds a little to the fact that the uptake of these projects has been slow. And in fact, we don't have as much private finance in these projects as we would have expected by now. So we were essentially reviewing with Alex where we were in terms of the status of additional carbon. And Alex, looked at the data, and I think this is a really helpful way of thinking about this allochthonous, this carbon that comes from outside of the project area and how it should be treated. Should we make discounts because it's outside of the project, or should we include it without discounting? And there are, various arguments for and against this. And from his paper, when you look at the different methodologies, the IPCC, the BlueCam, the Australian blue carbon method, or the Vera, which is one of the um, commercially applied methods, you see differences and therefore apparently inconsistencies in the way that this allochthonous or refractory, non-reactive organic carbon is being deducted from the stock. So, of course, Alex's paper drew some debate. Phil Williamson and colleagues who, are active reviewers of peer-reviewed published work in this field, questioned the climate mitigation value of these arguments, which, of course, is perfectly reasonable. And Alex and ourselves argued that, in fact, these do provide genuine climate mitigations. In many ways, these arguments are being rehearsed more than one place, and certainly Catherine Lovelock, in response to a similar criticism of the BlueCam Australian method, had rehearsed some of these arguments. And we made the point that, in fact, Williamson and friends had incorrectly stated that management interventions to protect vulnerable stores of blue carbon are not valid and permissible. And so, there's, even in the science of those working on blue carbon, there appears to be disagreement in terms of the consensus of what is possible and not possible. The argument here, of course, is that when you create the project, the carbon that comes into that project area is additional because it's not in the environment where it would normally be remineralized, and therefore it is partly protected and therefore can be accounted for. But this is still debated. It's a good thing that we have these scientific disagreements. I think all I'm saying is that we need, as a community, I think increasingly, to move towards stronger consensus on the application of things like carbon crediting for allochthonous carbon. So I think this will rumble on for a while. We're happy with it, of course, as scientists, but I think for external audiences, for financing restoration projects, we need to probably work together as a scientific community towards clearer messaging and stronger consensus. So, I think that's something to be aware of if you're engaged in these debates. And then my last slide, I'm conscious I've run out of time. That's links to the Sea Blues and our GoBC website and a generic email address if you'd like to promote your network through either of those. On the right-hand side, this is going back to, I think, 2019. The school children, their primary school children in the front there, helping us with a national mapping effort. So those school kids actually have a data point on a national stock assessment that's published. So that was fun. And the lady at the back with me there is now the cabinet secretary for the environment here in Scotland. Was a minister at the time and was very happy to engage in this kind of public outreach, youth engagement activity. So the other thing I would say that I've realized is that there are opportunities to engage a much wider audience, and that in that process, you can work with government to create and consolidate, these nature positive messages. I think on reflection, this has helped us, has generated an interest from government and support for our blue carbon work here in Scotland. So, that was a win-win, I think, for both of us. There was some media interest at the time. And I think, those kids hopefully haven't now, some years on, a new appreciation of the value of the coastal ecosystem, which was just below their school. And then, that same theme, I picked this photograph up on the left-hand side from COP28, which was the founding father of United Arab Emirates. A country's greatest investment lies in building generations of educated and knowledgeable youth. I think that, rings true. Something as early career scientists that, hopefully we all think that that's correct. But also, you know, I've talked a lot about a career that's progressed over time, over decades. But I think sometimes looking back and sharing that knowledge with the next generation that's coming after you as early career researchers is also really important. And I think it's often greatly appreciated by those who are evaluating you as an individual and as somebody who will make a difference. So I think I'll end on that note. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm sorry I've taken up quite a lot of time with the slides, but really happy to take questions. And I'll stop sharing now if I know how to do that.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was really interesting. Please don't be sorry. It was really good. Well, at least I really enjoyed it. Right, do we have any questions for Bill? Alex?
Hi, Bill. Great talk. I was thinking about, so you had quite a traditional, I guess, academic pathway through your career. I was wondering if you think the landscape's any different now, whether there's a greater amount of opportunities for non-academic blue carbon careers and pathways through companies like Vera and working with government, and if you see what kind of opportunities with that you see.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, yes, in many ways, I left school at 18 and joined the university environment, and I've never really worked in the real world. I suppose that might be a cruel way of putting it. I've enjoyed the career, and it's, as I've tried to show there, it's been quite variable, and it's created some great opportunities for travel and friendships and career. What I would say, and what I think is true, is that in this space, in this blue carbon space, there are a lot of opportunities for, applied research, using the evidence to support policy. So that's government, right? Using the evidence to support finance. So that might be through these Vera pathways and so on. And increasingly, I think, particularly in the challenges of science funding, I've noticed just in the last year or two a shift in philanthropy towards science that has a stronger advocacy agenda. And so by that, I mean maybe as a scientist working with an environmental NGO to support maybe a conservation agenda. And I think there's a growing opportunity in that space where the NGOs, can attract philanthropy and finance into their organization. They can sell the vision of conservation, but use the science that they do, to strengthen the evidence base. And I think that seems to be, gaining ground And a lot of the NGOs I know, are doing more of that. But they will also work, as you'd be aware, with academic partners to help them deliver, some of that work. So yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities in blue carbon. We had have a blue carbon forum here in Scotland that supported a number of PhD students. And I mentioned two, actually, I mentioned three that had come through that graduate process with government support. Coralie Hunt now works for Nature Scott, as you know, so that's an arm-length organization. It's essentially the sort of nature management side of Scotland's environment, but an arm-length organization to government. So she went from her PhD down that route. Kirsty Black went from her PhD on offshore sediments into this really rapidly expanding offshore renewables area. And I think in that case, she was using probably her geospatial skills to move in a slightly different direction. And then I think Craig Smeaton has followed more of the sort of traditional path. I think the difference there is we somehow didn't let him leave St Andrews. So he didn't do all of that mobility that is often part and parcel, of maybe moving from one place to another. But yeah, I think a lot of career opportunities. And what I would suggest is that the BluECR network, could be a really good way to promote job opportunities. And if anybody would like to reach out to me, I'm very shortly going to be advertising to, postdoc positions in this space. So really happy. I can share the advert with you, Alex, maybe to the network once those are live. But we'll have 2 postdoc opportunities here in the next few months. So yeah, really happy to share those. And there'll be many colleagues out there in our programs, our networks, who'll have similar opportunities.
Thank you so much, Bill. I was actually going to mention that we do have a LinkedIn page where we try to share upcoming events and any kind of openings as well.
Yeah,
To kind of
and do
try and help each other out.
So I'd be really happy if your group, if you can get a critical mass together for the conference in Glasgow in February.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for
We'll
inviting
try
us.
to do something to support you, and we'll get some of our senior colleagues who I know are going to be coming along. We can make sure they come meet with the ECRs, maybe have some sort of event to support you guys.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that opportunity. I will email you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I know we've run out of time probably, but if anybody else wants to email, I'm happy to follow up by email.
Just gonna stop the recording. Start with it.